Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and welcome to part 2 of our voyage through Asian horror films released during the year 2007. Now we are continuing with some of the less impressive titles here tonight, but as usual, there may be a few movies that sound interesting to you, and if that's the case, feel free to check them out, because you may like them even though I do not. But don't yell at me if you don't like them, because I'm technically not recommending any of the movies that we're discussing tonight. So let's get rolling, not waste any time here, and as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. Now our first film tonight is from Thailand, actually, and that is called The Screen at Kamchanod. Again, we are in 2007. So in 1987, organizers of a movie screening in the forest of Kamchanod in Thailand stumbled upon a chilling event. Although the screening was marked as a special event, no viewers actually showed up, but the projection crew rolled the film anyways. As the film was about to end, a group of people emerged from the forest and lined up in front of the screen, disappearing soon thereafter. 18 years later, a group led by a man and his wife nurse tracks down the original film and prepares to screen the movie at that same type of theater. Now, the group soon gets much more than what they bargained for, as you might expect, when they recreate what happened on that fateful night in 1987. So this is jam-packed with ghost scenes. This movie's jam-packed with horror elements and scare tactics, which should be a positive attribute in theory. But the big problem is that most of these moments, for me personally, consist of cheap jump scares with really a de-emphasis on constructing sequences that stay with you long after the film ends. You know, a lot of the scares here are very abrupt, very short, not the type of scares that I typically like, as you probably know by now, if you've been watching my reviews. I really feel like the horror in The Screen at Kamchanod is something that any mediocre director could really do. You know what I mean? It's just not something that's memorable or impressive. Now, having stuff pop out at you with loud noises, left and right in this film, because there's quite a few of those moments, is just not my idea of an enjoyable viewing experience. But if you like jump scares, there's a chance that you could like this movie. But even if you don't mind the jump scares, everything else in the film, I think, ranges from mediocre to poor anyways, so perhaps you wouldn't like this movie. The characters have zero personality, okay? The script is lame, and the ending is very unsatisfying, I think. It's just one of those films that, overall, if it had good acting, a good script, etc., etc., I could forgive it a little bit for having so many jump scares, but I really don't think it has any of those other things that can help lift it up above those flaws. Now, I cannot recommend this one, but if you want a Thai horror movie that incorporates the premise of a cinema, I got one for you from 2008. So when we reach 2008, I'll give you a recommendation that you might enjoy. This one, Screen at Kamchanod, I just cannot recommend. Now, our next film here is called Pocong 3. This one is from Indonesia. Now, if you remember from our coverage of 2006, we took a look back at Pocong 2, and I recommended that one because it seemed to have some heart to it. It's one of those films that had a low budget, isn't particularly great, but it had something to it, an X factor, had some heart to it that made it enjoyable. Focused on the characters quite a bit and was reasonably executed. Now, Pocong 3, unfortunately, is a step down from the last one. And I don't know if there was an original Pocong. Like, I saw Pocong 2, Pocong 3, but I never saw Pocong. So I don't know if there was one or what. But just to give you a heads up on that, you didn't miss one in my previous videos. I just never covered Pocong because either it doesn't exist or I haven't seen it. Now, the plot for Pocong 3 is that a dance club DJ discovers that her recently deceased father was involved in black magic. and that some of his abilities have actually passed down to her. Now, that could be a good thing, alright, but since this is a horror movie, we know that there will be some dangers involved with this inheritance, so to speak. The lead actress here I thought was actually pretty good. I liked her. The premise of a protagonist harnessing magic, it really felt like it wasn't explored very much in this movie. Kind of a missed opportunity there. So don't go into this expecting like a deep excursion into witchcraft, so to speak. Some of the crazy shenanigans that we saw back in the 1980s with Hong Kong sorcery films may have spoiled us a bit. If you've seen some of those movies, and they may have spoiled you, because those movies can get pretty freaking crazy. A lot of the contemporary witchcraft films don't quite get that nuts. So I'm just warning you, in case you're familiar with those movies. This one, the witchcraft elements are downplayed a little bit. I really wanted more black magic in this movie, but, if it has some other positive elements, it can make up for it, but this movie doesn't. It feels like there's actually certain parts of this movie that feel like a music video. Given the direction style and the editing, there's a lot of techno-pop music, because this protagonist is a DJ, so you gotta have a lot of techno-pop music in this movie, and it does, unfortunately. Although, there is some pretty good techno and pop out there, but it's not in this movie. And the editing is very spastic. It's got that MTV-style quick-cut editing thrown in at times. Just makes it feel like a music video. I did not like that. It makes it I guess, hinders the cinematic flair, so to speak. Also, the horror sequences do use that unique Pocong ghost that we saw in Pocong 2, but the direction and filmmaking techniques are very cliched in how it uses them. There's some loud scoring used at times, some crescendos and noises used. Doesn't really go for the creepiness that Pocong 2 is going for. This one's more, scare tactics are a bit cheaper, just like the last film we covered from Thailand. Although there are not nearly as many jump scares in Pocong 3 as there was in the screen of Kamchanod. So unfortunately, I cannot recommend Pocong 3, but if you've seen Pocong 2 and you liked it, check it out. Alright, our next film tonight is another film ending in a number, and we're going to see a trend tonight. Oh yes, there's going to be a number of movies, pun intended, that end in a number in the title. And this one is called Lantai 13, also known as Dead Floor. And this is an Indonesian horror film. Now, Luna has just gotten her first job as a secretary from a major company in Jakarta. She's got her own desk, some good friends, and a seemingly friendly boss. There's only one problem. Ever since Luna started working for the firm, she's been having horrifying visions, and she's certain that something happened on the 13th floor of the building. However, everyone in the building claims that there isn't a 13th floor, which is actually, I'll get to that later. There's not even a button for it in the elevator, so how could this be? As Luna seeks help from her boyfriend, she discovers that her hunch may be right, but she has no idea what terrors are ahead of her. Now, very quickly before I get into this film, I'm not sure how it is in other countries, but in the U.S., there have been times where I have seen where there is no 13th floor in a building. Because 13 is considered unlucky or whatnot. So or at least sometimes, I'll see, floor 12, and then it goes to floor 14 on an elevator. And sometimes that's true where the 13th floor is just relabeled as 14, but other times in hotels, sometimes they'll use the 13th floor as like a maintenance floor, where you'll have a lot of equipment or maintenance supplies to help the employees, just quickly get to things that they need and, to service the customers and whatnot. But in any case, it was just kind of interesting to see this implemented in this Indonesian horror film, which I wasn't quite expecting. So perhaps 13 is an unlucky number in a number of countries. Now this film, if you listen to my plot synopsis, a haunted floor in a building, pretty generic premise, right? But that's exactly what this film is, generic, unfortunately. The horror scenes are fairly underwhelming. using the Japanese onryo, unfortunately, supplemented with loud noises and cheap jump scares. Looks like cheap jump scares is going to be a theme for tonight, unfortunately. Usually, Indonesian horror films have those nasty-looking ghosts with, like, the white hair and the white eyes. You don't really get that in this movie. At least I don't remember it being in this movie. They opt for, like, the Japanese onryo, which, whatever. The acting is also pretty dodgy in this film. Did not like it very much. Plot is simplistic. It also feels a bit stretched out. I don't remember what the runtime was, but it did feel a little bit lengthy. Pretty boring stuff for the most part. This was actually a pretty big disappointment for me because when I first saw it years ago, I had heard about it for a few years prior to that from a few different websites, some of which no longer exist. They were review sites. And they talked this up pretty good, this Lantai 13. So I was pretty excited for it. It was one of those instances where, you people know this if you've followed me over this year. There are some movies you want to watch. You can't watch them because they're not available on DVD. So I waited, kept searching for it. Eventually it popped up on YouTube, so I got to see it on YouTube. Not sure if it's still up there or not, but it was a pretty big disappointment for me, unfortunately. I was hoping I could find a hidden gem, but it's not the case here. So if you have not heard of this movie, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I don't really think it's worth seeking out. Let's move on here. We are country hopping again tonight. It's pretty nice. We're hitting a lot of different countries in this playlist. Of course, this country is one that we're very familiar with, and that is Japan. And it's another film with a number at the end of the title. And it's the third consecutive film with the number 3 in that title. It's quite odd. That is Apartment 1303. That's 3 movies in a row that ended in a number. So while celebrating with her friends in her new cheaply rented apartment with a balcony and view of the sea, well, that's quite a deal, on the 13th floor of a building, wow, I didn't even notice that. That's a consistency tonight. A young Sayaka unexpectedly jumps off the balcony committing suicide. Now, her mother goes insane subsequently, and her older sister, Mariko, decides to investigate her mysterious death. So she finds that there have been many suicides of young women living in this particular apartment. And she also finds a book telling the tragic story of the first tenants of this apartment, which uncovers the truth, of course, behind these suicides. Now, the problem here is the script, okay, which plays it way too safe, with cliches stacked on top of one another. This is simply too formulaic and derivative to be memorable, in my opinion. It really kind of, I would have to say the first hour is somewhat watchable despite the cliches, but it really tanks during the final 30 minutes with unconvincing special effects and poor scare attempts. In terms of positives, though, I would say that the camera work is mostly effective and the lead actresses are both good. I'm a fan of Noriko Nakagoshi, who was the lead in this, and also she previously starred in Rattle Rattle from the Unholy Women anthology, which I covered previously. Very impressive anthology, and she was very good in Rattle Rattle. Also, Eriko Hatsune is a supporting actress in this movie, and you will recognize her from Uzumaki. But Apartment 1303, it's one of those films that's a product of the industry. Ghost films got popular. They produced a lot of good ones, but some of them just feel, they just feel forgettable. It's forgettable. Now, at some point in the future, I'm actually thinking of doing a video to rank the remakes of Asian horror films. And let me tell you, the American remake of Apartment 1303 is historic in its awfulness. Like, if you thought, I always hear people complain about the remakes of Pulse and Shudder, which are obviously justified because both those movies are pretty bad. But oh boy, you haven't seen anything yet. If you thought those movies were bad, the American remake of Apartment 1303 is there's just no words to describe it. So I might do that video just to cover that remake because it's just so awful. But yeah, just a heads up for you. Now, the next film tonight, oh dear, we stay in Japan. This one has a pretty interesting premise to it, and I was pretty stoked when I heard about it, especially when I heard the title of the film, but it did not come through. And that is, of course, the Girls' Rebel Force of Competitive Swimmers, also known as Attack Girls Swim Team versus the Undead, a Japanese exploitation horror action movie. That's a mouthful, my friends, and with a title like that, you gotta deliver some crazy stuff, but this movie does not. A high school girls swim team fight off zombies. I mean, the premise is that simple. The team is basically having a competition, but a mysterious virus is spreading throughout the school, and after one of them discovers the incident and tries to tell other people, she's killed. Consequently, the swimming team takes up the challenge to cope with it and begins a fierce battle. Now, obviously, this is a straight-faced black humor film from start to finish, which could be a good thing, but it never really induces a high level of excitement at any time during this movie. The bloody moments are actually pretty decent, despite some poor fighting choreography. And remember, this is kind of an action or a horror action film hybrid, where it would be nice to see some pretty good fighting or some interestingly constructed conflicts with the zombies, let's put it that way. It never really does that, and there's very little action to be had here, so that's disappointing. Production values are very low in this, very low. This is a very micro-budgeted film. So if you're expecting a higher octane theatrical film, you're not going to get that here. It's just one of those flicks that fails to provide what it so flamboyantly advertises on the poster art, you know? I mean, yeah, there is some gratuitous nudity and a little bit of sex, but that will only get you so far in my book. So, yeah, this one, you can skip it. Now, the next 6 films we're going to cover tonight, we have 6 left. Or actually, we have fewer than that, don't we? I think I changed this. We actually only have 4 left. I'm sorry, I knocked out 2 of them, because one of them I rewatched, bumped it up to our next video, and the other one really wasn't a horror film. So I included it as my honorable mention. So, I personally would not recommend these final 4 films that we're covering tonight, but I am going to give you a flavor of these, and they're not that bad. Okay, they're not that bad. So if any of them sound interesting, feel free to check them out. Now, the first one here is actually quite creative, and, I did actually like it the first time I saw it. And that is Naraka 19, a Hong Kong fantasy horror film. So when Rain, a beautiful university student, receives a message on her mobile phone, do you know what the 19th gate of hell is? The nightmare begins for her, but before long she realizes that she is unwittingly trapped in a terrifying game from hell, and this game is larger than life because if you lose, you die. As the same cryptic message goes out to other students on campus, she is extremely frightened to see that her best friends are dying at different stages of this game. So to survive, she tries her best to reach the final stage, the 19th gate of hell. Now let's get to the biggest positives of Naraka 19. The set designs and the visuals within the different levels of hell are interesting and fun to watch. This isn't a high-budget Hollywood film that can really give you a realistic depiction of this, but it's still pretty good, and it's interesting to watch, I think. You get, for example, rain in the form of sharp butcher knives, which is a very interesting creative touch. You also get a grim reaper dude with tons of crows flying over his head. Stuff like that. Stuff that really kind of hits my sweet spot in terms of visuals. This movie has some scenes like that. And consequently, the atmosphere during these scenes is effective. Scoring in general is also quite enjoyable. However, I would say that, as I mentioned, the quality of the special effects, like the actual design of these realms is cool, but the actual quality of the special effects is kind of a mixed bag, and they do look fake at times, but, in a fantasy horror film, that flaw I think is somewhat acceptable. Now, the major problems of this film here are the poor dialogue, the sloppy schizophrenic script, and the illogical thought processes of the various dim-witted characters. For example, at one point a girl asks another girl why she's playing this hellish game. And she says, quote, "I want to know what happened to my friend," unquote. So that's a reasonable explanation. She's playing the game to find her missing friend. That makes sense. But then she immediately follows it up with this one. Quote, "I also want to know what the 19th level of hell is. We always talk about 18 levels of hell. I've never heard of 19 before," unquote. And that's where, you just say, excuse me? Listen, if there's a 19th level of hell, I never want to see what that's like. And this girl just goes in like, I just want to see what the 19th level of hell is. So there's definitely a problem with the script writing in this one that, is kind of unrecoverable. You can only shake your head a little bit at the dialogue. That happens quite a bit in this movie. In between the hellish set pieces, and there are a few of them, the story and the characters are static and drag badly. I actually rewatched this one recently, and it doesn't have that story that drives in between the hellish moments. You know what I mean? You have a hellish moment, and then it just kind of dies off, and you're just kind of waiting for the next horror scene to show up. That's not really the hallmark of a quality film. Although the horror scenes are fun to watch, they are fairly short, okay? The horror scenes are fairly short, and the specific challenges within them are simplistic. So you have this scenario where, you have the set or the actually construct of the hell level to be interesting, and you have the character get in there, okay, good so far, but what she has to do to get out is pretty simplistic and not very engaging, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? It would have been interesting to have more lengthy shots or lengthy sequences within some of these levels of hell that need her to solve some type of demonic puzzle or find her way out of a demonic maze or, whatever. It doesn't really do that. So that's kind of disappointing in my opinion. And of course, you don't get to see all 19 levels of hell because the movie's only, 100 minutes long. So there is a certain amount of creativity in Naraka 19, as well as an odd feel to it. It has a different feel than most horror films. It makes it a little bit easier to watch, I think. Especially in terms of ineptly written horror films, this one's easier to watch than a lot of other ones. But if you really want a good fantasy-based horror film, check out Recycle, which I covered back into our 2006 coverage, because it's far superior to Naraka 19, and it has almost none of the flaws that show up in this movie. And now that I think about it, while I'm doing this playlist, I notice certain things as I order the movies. I'm kind of wondering if Naraka 19 was inspired by Recycle, and they just kind of churned it out as kind of a, trying to cash in on the popularity of Recycle. I'm not sure about that, but I would not be surprised. So I do not recommend this one, even though it has some creative flourishes and is quite different. So if you thought we were done with underwhelming Asian horror films that end in a number, you're in for a surprise, because we got another one. And this one also ends in a 9. You got Naraka, Naraka 19? It actually ends in 19 too. And that is Body 19, also known simply as Body, a Thai horror film. Now, I'm in the minority on this one. This one is actually quite popular in online circles, but I did not like it, and I'll get to why in a minute. First, the plot. An engineering student living in a rented house in Bangkok with his sister is having some bad dreams, okay, in which he is visited by a ghostly woman who appears to have been dismembered and put back together. He also sees a misshapen black cat and occasionally sees a fetus. Now, this guy finds himself in places such as a musical performance and whatnot, and cannot remember how he got there, so his mind is going on him too. It's eventually discovered that there is a connection with a mysterious university lecturer who possesses supernatural powers of hypnosis. So this movie, as I said before, seems to get some pretty good reviews online. I found it to be a pretty bitter disappointment. The script is clunky and too thin to fill 2 full hours of screen time. This one is 2 hours long. It just doesn't have enough content, I think, to drive that runtime. Most of the horror sequences are ineffective. consisting of lame scenarios, cheap jump scares again, theme tonight, and some cartoony CGI. Some of the acting I thought was pretty poor too. I didn't really like the lead actor in this one too much. It does attempt to be psychological and dramatic at times, but it simply does not work. The script isn't strong enough to make that work. I also thought the twists were really stupid in this one, and I laughed at some of the serious moments. That's not a good thing, obviously. We've seen these plot turns before. I won't say what they are for the sake of not spoiling for you, in case you want to watch it, but the fact that they are so unconvincingly executed here results in a lot of eye rolls. I was rolling my eyes multiple times. So, Body 19, I'm personally not a fan of it. A lot of people are, though. That's all I'll say. All right. Our next film here, we travel to the Philippines, all right? And we have a film called Ouija, I guess that's how you pronounce it, from the Philippines. Now, two half-sisters, along with their first cousins, reunite in an island province to bury their grandmother. Upon discovering their old childhood Ouija board, the girls dare each other to call on the spirits of the dead. Now, this, of course, it's a fantastic decision that will, of course, end very well for everyone. So in the middle of the ritual, the Ouija board is accidentally burned, trapping a mysterious entity inside of it. In a race against time, of course, and imminent death, the girls seek out the spirit's identity and its burial place, hoping to release the spirit from the Ouija board and survive its fatal hauntings. Does this film sound generic? Well, that's because it is. The scare tactics are commonplace, run-of-the-mill, and lazy. Some stuff jumps out at the characters, of course. It's cheap jump scare night in my video list. Usually grabbing them. A lot of the cheap jump scares of this film will grab the character, for added emphasis, I guess. It's still cheap. During the Ouija scenes, some of the flashing lights and wind are used. They use a lot of flashing lights and wind, which, it's alright. Some ghosts are peppered in here and there. I would have to say that the big finale in this movie is a pretty big anticlimax, actually. Story and characters are bland. It don't really make up for the flimsiness of the scares. In terms of positives, I would say that this film looks pretty good overall. But if you're going to completely forget about this within a week, is it really worth watching? No. And I would say it's not. Skip it. Alright, our last film tonight is from South Korea, actually. And again, they're trying to mix things up here, but it just didn't work. And that film is called Evil Twin. So it's set during the Joseon era of Korean history, and a village is basically haunted by a ghost here. So when an accident claims the life of a young girl, Hyo-jin, her twin sister, So-yeon, falls into a coma and awakens 10 years later. Now, many deaths follow her recovery, and she seemingly takes on her sister's personality traits. So there's a little bit of promise in this, okay? You kind of have a generic overall premise, but this is set hundreds of years in the past, and has a little bit of a psychological angle to it. So the change in setting and the time period is pretty nice, but unfortunately, actually I should say that seems to be what most positive reviews online seem to point out, okay? It's kind of like that, they say, well, it's historical, so it's automatically so much different from most Asian ghost films. But I would say that most everything else in Evil Twin, outside of the set and the time period, are derivative and run-of-the-mill. Scare tactics are cliched, generally weak. Some use of Japanese onryo ghosts in here, which, you kind of wish they would have done something more authentic and cultural for the time period, but they choose the Japanese onryo. We've seen that a bunch of times already. Story and characters themselves are kind of hard to watch. I mean, they're not bad. There's nothing particularly bad in terms of the characters or script. They just don't really grab you. They're not interesting or colorful enough to hold your interest in between the horror. And because of these various weaknesses, the whole change of time and setting feels kind of like a gimmick here. It really does feel kind of gimmicky. It's similar in some ways to the equally dull Blood Rain from 2005. Again, I might be in the minority in that one as well too, but I also think that one has, a setting in the historical past, but it just doesn't have the plot or the characters to make it engaging. This one is just so vanilla. It just kind of mutes any of the other positives that it has for it. It simply becomes a bland movie that's set in the past instead of the present. You know what I mean? But with that said, I would say that the production values in The Evil Twin are quite good. They were very good, which is no surprise if you've seen your fair share of contemporary South Korean horror films, because that's consistent there for the most part. Also, I did like the lead actress quite a bit. Her name is Shin-hye Park, and she's been in some very, very popular and good television series and movies. But I would say that Evil Twin is one of her weaker projects. But if you're a fan of hers, feel free to check it out. So I can't recommend Evil Twin, really. It kind of blows the opportunity to have a, historical-based horror movie. Of course, Japan has done that a million times, right? Films from the 50s and 60s, and even films from the present day, they've done a handful of them that have worked quite well. South Korea, though, Evil Twin did not work. So, that's part 2 of our journey through Asian horror films from 2007. And of course, be sure to join me for part 3, where we'll crack into some of the more enjoyable titles. Just hang with me. We'll get there. And as always, we'll see you next time.